Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Today, we are moving beyond the hype of AI to talk about plumbing, specifically the massive gaping security hole that is agent identity. Our guest today is Ian Livingstone, the CEO and co founder of Keycard. He's a serial builder who specializes in abstracting away the pain of infrastructure. He started in the trenches of the real time web at GoInstant, which was acquired by Salesforce, leading him into the Heroku ecosystem, where he learned the art of developer experience. He then co founded Manifold, a marketplace that attempted to unbundle the cloud, which was later acquired by Sneak in 2021. At Sneak, Ian was a senior leader helping build and scale their platform during the explosive growth phase. Ian is also the host of the InfraPod, where he explores the bleeding edge of software infrastructure. He's now turned his sights on what he calls the non-human identity crisis, betting his career that the way we secure AI agents requires a fundamental architectural shift, moving away from static API keys to dynamic identity-based tokens. Ian, welcome to the show. We are super thrilled to have you here.
Awesome. Well, I'm so excited to be here. Not every day do I get to talk about AppSec and how boring it should be all at the same time, especially in the last little bit since I've been working on Keycard. I mean, at the core of it, it's all application security, but that's all
Yeah.
people think.
Yeah, is there anything else you want to add to your introduction or about Keycard that you want
Yeah,
the audience to know?
love to. First and foremost, if you're struggling to build agents, you're struggling to think about how you control and manage their access, you're struggling to deploy MCP or use MCP in production, or you're worried about all of the risks, you should really check out Keycard. Working on some solutions for you at keycard.ai, and we'd love to show you what we're working on and help you understand how what we're building can help you accelerate your adoption of agents or how you build agents.
Okay, cool. Yeah. Thanks for joining the show. So Ian, I want to start at the starting, right? One of the we've spoken about AI a lot on this podcast, to the point where it's getting a little annoying now, right? But
Yep.
I think the one area where I kind of feel like we haven't gone deep but spoken about at a high level a lot is just on identity and AI agents, right? So we all know it's a problem. We all know that identity was built for humans essentially, and then we kind of did some abstractions to kind of say, hey, how do we kind of authenticate things which were, where the humans authenticated an API, whatever token, and then that led to automation. So that was still one step removed from a human authorizing something, and that's something authenticating something else, right? So that still was okay. But with agents, it kind of feels like, and with MCP servers, for example, it kind of feels like what access you should have to something is not dependent on who is the person who authorized it, because that construct of a person being behind an identity doesn't exist anymore. So before we go into security issues, before we go into kind of the solutions, before we go into anything else, how should we think about identity in the age of agents?
Yeah, absolutely. That is a great question, and I think there's like two narratives that are basically pushed
Mhm.
from vendors, and there's like the what. Let's talk about how things actually are, right? And there's sort of agents or apps, and then there's this sort of narrative that agents are. You can think of agents as another type of human, right? I think both of those narratives really fall apart because if we actually think about what is happening under the hood, what does AI represent? Like, and what is the core sort of like risk? Like, what's the net new thing, right? In this whole, like, why are we doing this? Like, why are we here? Why do we talk about any of this? Well, it's because we've had this like very cool invention called the transformer, and then we applied a lot of at scale compute to it, and we built a very lossy but very incredible query engine that allows us to reason over and over again. But it does that in a non-deterministic fashion, right? And what we're witnessing is because these LLMs allow us to take natural language or different analog or human inputs and then reason about them and compute on them in a way we've never been able before, that gives us like a new UI UX paradigm, right? So now we have chat or voice or video, all these different like interaction mechanisms in our applications that are different than previously. And so I think first and foremost, before we go talk about identity, let's reason about at the core of what's the delta, right? And at the delta, what's happening is that we're basically having LLMs, non-deterministic things, to formulate systems of action, systems of decision, and systems of reasoning on top of our core deterministic systems. And as a result of that, we have a disintermediation between, humans who used to be making all of the decisions, and you'd be able to attribute any decision that's made, whether it's how the code was written or the user of the app, back to a human one way or the other, to a world where it's actually like a piece of machinery that is making decisions. You can no longer attribute all of the decisions back to the human. You can say, hey, this decision was made by agent X on behalf of person Y, but person Y doesn't want to say, well, it's my decision. I did ask this thing to make this decision, right? And so I think that's first and foremost the most important thing to consider. And then the next most important thing to consider about agents and identity, and why is this even worth talking about, is, well, these things are non-deterministic. They're not smart. They're not stupid, right? It's a probability distribution. It's a lossy encoding. It's magical, but it can hallucinate, right? That is actually the core feature. That is why this is interesting. And it's also the fundamental flaw. And we see that in a lot of like agentic security challenges around it. And so, as a result of that, not only do we have this problem where we want to be able to say, hey, we want to be able to differentiate between the actors, right? Human versus agent. We also are going to have different security models, different trust models, because the last 30 years of security have been basically built on top of a static trust model, where it's like, if I can sort of draw a box and identify who the human is, and I know that's a human, I can say, well, okay, we've authenticated that's a human. We can have very static trust model around what they can do, and then just basically say, well, as long as we know it's Ian, we trust Ian to have these permissions. Whereas with agents, because they're non-deterministic and because they love to hallucinate, the more access you give to them, the wider the possible blast radius, so they go off the rails and do something you don't want to do, right? And so you actually have to fundamentally do the thing we've always wanted to do in security, which is approach this from a principle of least privilege, right? Which is ultimately, at the end of the day, what you want to do with an agent is you want to say, I only want to give you a minimal amount of access just for you to perform the task that you've been assigned, right? And so ultimately, when we think about agent identity, we're really talking about solving a problem we've had in computing for a very long time, which was like proper delegated access, permissioned access that's scoped to a specific thing that someone actually wants to do, right? We've talked about it for a long time, but we never really have had to do it. At the end of the day, well, I know it's a human, I trust them, that's okay. And so if we step back and say, well, why is this an interesting topic? It's really to say, if we want to move from a world where humans are making the decisions to where we're able to defer decision making of some class, right? We want to enhance software to have a level of autonomy. And there's, just like with self-driving cars, there's like level 1 autonomy all the way to like the Waymo. You then have to have the subsequent systems of control in place to basically ensure that they had kept on task and kept and don't create problems for themselves as we try to give them more autonomy over time, right? Yeah. And so at the core of that is an identity and access problem. And every iteration and every platform shift, right, we've gone from the mainframe to e-commerce and the web to cloud computing, we have always gone through a revolution in IAM, right? There's been multi-user systems and Unix to TLS and the browser model and cookies to IAM built into the clouds and all of the wonderful things that it's software-defined networking gave us to the next generation, which is, well, all of those things kind of end up collapsing at the application layer. And now we truly have identity as the only perimeter that matters. And that needs to be interoperable across all of the apps, whether they're internal and external.
Yeah. Great points, right? So before we go to delegated access, which I think is probably the core of this argument, right? Let me ask you a dumb-ish question, right? I mean, we've always had identity which is not tied to a human. I mean, think of service accounts, right? Which run stuff, right? Which even if a service account goes wrong, can you go blame a human who kind of orchestrated that? Maybe, but not really, right? So we've had that paradigm, but this one's obviously different. But why can't what we did with service accounts work with agents?
Yeah, I think you can kind of squint and say maybe, but the truth of it is, well, what is an agent, right? And one way or the other, and I would argue that an agent, like a definition of an agent, is like everything is an agent. Nothing's an agent. All agents are apps. All apps are agents. Right. It's really a question of like the level of autonomy of decision making they have, and I would say the level of non-determinism involved in a computation. Right. Now, looking at that from that perspective, I think that the fundamental question you have is, well, we have service accounts or we have OAuth. Right. Correct. Those two worlds are not connected, and they're not connected together with a federated protocol, and they actually exist in two completely different domains, right? The world of machine identity or service identity, we don't have OIDC for service accounts, right? It's like you have service accounts inside Kubernetes, and those are different, and they don't talk to service accounts inside my Postgres database. They don't talk to, in my Snowflake, right? It is many different islands in the world. And they don't have, they don't connect machine identity to the concept of user identity. Those are also completely different worlds, right? And so the minute that you have any type of delegation, whether it's agent to agent and service to service to service, and you then have the property that I just told you, which is, well, we want to scope these things very tightly. We also want them to be highly interoperable because the level of access, interoperability they have is actually directly related to the amount of value they can create, right? Because at the core of what is an agent, what is one of the core things that we must understand about this revolution is it's not the LLM itself that is actually the magical thing. The magical thing is the fact that depending upon the context that you give to the LLM, the data, the prompt, the different interactions between different models, the access to actionability, so tools you provide it can solve tasks without anyone writing any new code, right? Yep. That's the magical thing, right? And so when you look at it and think of it from that perspective, service accounts and our old models, all these different islands, they come from a world where software was static, software broadly lived on islands, and the only thing that we had to interconnect and was driven by enterprise adoption and social login on the web was user federation to make it easier for us to log into apps. But now you have agents where you need these agents to be able to connect, or these agents to be able to talk to each other, both within my company, but also to all of my external things across my company. If I'm a consumer, I'm going to have agents that want to talk to all of my eBays and my Shopifys, and I'll talk to my bank. I want to talk to my Google Drive, and I might have stuff on my computer that all needs to talk, this level of interoperability to actually allow us to enable to realize the promise of actual what agents are, right? So one of the things I often tell people is okay, let's go look at the multiples in the stock market. The predication of a lot of those multiples are driven by the idea of realizing the upside of this agentic revolution. If you were to sit back and say, well, you can't have it because there's no interoperability, then the whole story falls apart, right? Now, obviously, that's not why we're here. And so as a result of that, we have to sort of change our systems, and things that were previously islands and were previously static must become interoperable and heavily dynamic.
Yeah. One last question, just so that I can build a mental model for this, right? So let's say I have a browser agent. I want to hook up my browser agent to my email because I don't know, I'm irresponsible or something, right? And then I have 100 emails, and I want the agent to triage every email. If it's a spammy person trying to sell me something, I want to hit unsubscribe or reply, don't bother me. But if it's my customer asking me a critical question, I don't want it to reply, right? Yep. If you think about authorization, I can give it read access and write access and delete access maybe, but I can't really say read access to important emails and reply access to whatever, to junk email, right? So this is kind of where the simplest form of IAM breaks down with agents for me. So if this is, again, I know we'll have a deeper discussion on this, but if I have to pick a mental model of how we can solve something like this, what is it? Is it that there's a judgment LLM saying, hey, every time you reply to an email, you kind of figure out what the email is and then you decide? Because then I'm like, okay, who's going to judge the judger, I guess? I don't know, right? So I'm kind of trying to build a mental model of how to think about identity authorization with agents. And is there a simplified way of thinking about this, or is this, are we too far from it? Just yet.
Yeah, I think there is a very simplified way of it, right? So the predication of your argument is well, today we have read and write, and maybe maybe delete as permissions, right? So I can send an email, you can delete an email, you can read my email is all we have permissioning, and that was completely satisfactory. Maybe you can read my user information in a pre-agentic world, right?
Yeah.
Because it solved most of the use cases. What's happening is if you, and I think a good example is if you spend some time talking to folks that want to use Snowflake inside ChatGPT. I think this is interesting for anyone. I know all three of us are involved in B2B some way, one or the other.
Yeah.
Lots of customer data, lots of PII, lots of stuff you never want to be leaked into the world of agents. But there's a lot of value in connecting agents or something as simple as ChatGPT. So, random person in ops can query Snowflake without having to talk to like a data engineer or build a dashboard, right? Like it's a huge amount of value. Problem, there's data inside that Snowflake instance that user may have access to if they go to snowflake.com, but that agent shouldn't have access to, because that agent, ChatGPT, may then call a tool and take that data and say, take it to browse on the web with it, right? Now, all of a sudden you've exfiltrated customer PII. And this is the entire argument why like a lot of companies don't allow these things to happen, and why shadow IT around MCP and all this agent stuff is such a huge challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Then you say, well, that's a problem for the consumer. So us as like IT people or AppSec folks, it's also a problem for Snowflake, because Snowflake wants to be the agentic data lake, right? They want you to connect to ChatGPT. And the same thing with your email inbox. We want to be the agentic forward email inbox, right? And so what's going to happen is, because agents are driving new use cases, the granularity of permissioning and the expressibility of policy and how the policy is expressed on every app is going to go from, we've got 3 scopes today, and it's like basically 3 check boxes, to much more granular, much more standardized policy across all these application services. And then what's going to happen internal to these applications, and if you're in the enterprise, you probably know this already, a lot of companies are now having conversations around, holy crap, how do we upgrade, whether we're building software, how do we upgrade our IAM stack so we can support these new agentic use cases? Because our customers want to have agentic workflows. We want to be able to sell our end user agentic workflows, so productivity increase is huge. It's the next level of software. We all want to have an agent forward story, but there's this fundamental problem at the core of how we've built authentication and authorization into our apps for a very long time. Part of that problem is we deal with auth and offset at the edge instead of deep down in the app. The other part is we have very shallow permissioning that's centralized instead of distributed, right? The third part of the problem is permissioning is static instead of dynamic. So you can't dynamically say, hey, for this grant or this like period of time, this thing only has the access to do this stuff, right? And that's not carried forward a token and merged together with other data. And then you can't deal with delegations, right? You can't, for most IAM models, you can't actually sit there and say, hey, if it's ChatGPT, they can read any data that's non-PII from these sandboxes, but they can't do anything else, right? Nobody has that IAM or permissioning model out there. And so this is the fundamental problem. But the underlying componentry, right? And then the upside here is the promise is huge. And so all these companies are going to go through and say, all right, we got to update this stuff, right? And then I think your question really is, at the end of the day, if you're an AppSec practitioner, right, or if you're someone building, like, how do we build adaptive policy? Because we don't want to go and like write policy for all these different scenarios. Well, I think at the end of the day, we still need hyper-deterministic rule systems, and you will have like LLMs and agent systems that will help you craft adaptive policy, but will be then driven also by deterministic, right? So I think you can think of it as like human supplies natural language, generates SQL, then validate against rule set, right? Like, and I think policy will be very much the same, and that's how we end up with policy scale. And I think the other component of this is your identity systems, the things that you're going to use that you use to govern your actual like identity sprawl across all these different apps. They have to move from a world where they're static, user orientated. Basically, it's like, hey, this user can access this app with this group, to something that's much more centralized and much more focused on runtime control versus like identity orchestration, which is what we have today.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. And I think weirdly, if we solve that, it'll probably solve a lot of problems in authentication outside the agentic world as well, which has been around for a long time, but nobody solved it. But
we never had a reason to, right? Like it was like, yes, it's a problem, but it only hurts us 0.1% of the time. And so, like we can kind of write that on to off, right? Versus now it's like, oh, we can't do the thing unless we actually have it. And that changes like the investment criteria.
Yeah. So I have a couple of questions here, Ian. Speaking about non-determinism and sort of agents being very different as compared to user accounts like service accounts. Also, OAuth came up with their top 10 for agentic applications, and there was one word I kept seeing quite a lot is agent's intent, or how do you know what access an agent needs? So you have to focus on the intent. So I guess my question is, in this agentic sort of workflow where each step that the agent can take can vary significantly from the previous step, which means that the access controls might also want to change, right? How are you thinking about verifying the agent intent? And because it's I'm pretty sure it's not trivial, because the intent itself can be manipulated into something malicious. So how is your mental model shaping up to address those kind of security risks, and also to make sure that each action that the agent is taking, it is appropriately scoped?
This is such a good question. I actually just did a podcast on the whole OAuth top 10 a couple days ago with one of the CISO at DPT Labs. We actually had a long conversation with this exact question, right? And I think we have to step back a hot second and basically talk about what the three pillars of problems are when it comes to agentic security. We have a supply chain problem. We've always had supply chain problems, right? How do I know the thing I'm talking to is the thing that it is, that it's a good thing, it has been tampered with, right? Local MCP servers are the greatest example of this, right? Which is no one knows where they came from. They somehow run locally, and then they're taking unvalidated input, and then sometimes they're running in a bash shell. And what the hell? What is going on, right? So, there's lots of supply chain challenges in AI, but those are not net new problems. In fact, I think the supply chain challenges are probably things that have changed the least. When we think about agentic security, we really have been thinking about those problems a lot in the last 10 years. You have sort of your identity and access problem, which is how do I know? So you talk about agent intent, but I think the other component of it is how do I know that the intent of the user hasn't been tampered with, right? So if I give a prompt, or a system programmer, the person that gave the agent purpose, right? Whether that is a user delegating access to do a task, or it's me, a developer of an agent at some corporation, give it some tasks. How do I know that hasn't been tampered with, right? So there's some sort of here's the signed prompt. It hasn't been touched. We know it comes from this person. There's lots of variations. You have the same thing on tool poisoning, right? Which is, how do we know the tool that it's using has been messed with? That there's hallmarks of identity and access problems, or hallmarks of supply chain problems there too. But how do we know the tool has been poisoned with? There is, obviously model poisoning challenges. Or how do we know the model that this whole thing is running on hasn't been tampered with, or has hidden nefarious, malicious intent, right? So those look like supply chain problems. They also look like identity and access problems, depending upon depends on how you squint at them. Then you have our biggest challenge, right, at the core of all of this, which is the data security challenge, which is, how do I deal with the fact that you have input that potentially is malicious, that your tools can go to websites like a github.com issue that someone's added a prompt that is malicious, right? And then it changes the behavior of the agent, or changes the behavior of the tool. You then have, the challenge we had with the data exfiltration problem I talked about with the PI at Snowflake, to then agent does silly thing to puts on a web browser query, puts in a query parameter back to Google, right? Those data security challenges are probably the biggest net new risk that we have to deal with. And I think ultimately at the cornerstone of all of this is there is identity and access, which is how do we know the different parties, and how do we validate the different parties, and how do we have policy decision points? And what is identity and access anyways, other than just a giant policy decision points, right? And allowing those policy decision points to have enough context to be able to express yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And then how do you drive the sort of generation and adaptability of those policy points, and then also the different parties that have control rods at any point. So a user that's given an agent some capacity can say no, or the agent can be hey, that's not the user, I don't validate the user, or it's not the right input, or so on and so on. You can keep holistic control of the system. I think that's the most interesting question. And I don't have solid answers to it. I will say this: if your agent is operating on data and assets that you control, and is only accessed by users and systems that you control, your problem set is significantly smaller. The minute you have an agent that's going out on the public internet, you've now created a massive problem for yourself, right? Because you're going out to a place where you have unvalidated, unsecured information that can then be interpreted. And so I think the biggest risk, if we're honest about an agent security, is public data access, public tool calling, or public prompting on one side or the other, right? Because if it's the user, and it's a user authenticated prompt, and they poison their own context window effectively when they're interacting with an agent, that's really the user's problem, right? Like it's not the agent builder's problem. And the same thing with the agent builder. It's like if the agent builder gives a bad prompt to the agent that they built, then that's really the agent builder's problem. If the system that the agent is interacting with, doesn't have proper authentication authorization of the agent, the user, that's really this resource owner's problem. It's when you have this sort of unauthenticated, untrusted actor, which is what happens in this like GitHub issue, which is where you start to have these like really challenging what the hell do we do problems, right? Because you don't know who the user was that posted it. You can't trust that they posted something. You can kind of trust GitHub, but you can't trust that GitHub has the proper controls in place to prevent these type of poisoning issues from the context, like the intent of the task that's being done. And so you have this whole awful sort of supply chain data security challenge that I just talked about. And so I think we have good solutions for internal systems. We don't have very good solutions for cross-network, untrusted source and data access and tool calling. And that I think that's the biggest unsolved problem. And that there is a lot of identity and access issues there as well, which I'm happy to talk about. But that's sort of how I think about it.
So I think the data security problem you mentioned is really interesting because I think when LLMs first came out, I feel like the model companies, the SOTA model companies did a fantastic job at actually addressing data security issues by kind of almost partnering with like AWS and Azure and making sure the models are hosted within your cloud environment. So if you're an enterprise who is doing it, you're like, hey, all your data is where you are. All that kind of flipped when agents came on the board, and agents could send your data anywhere now. You're not sending it to the LLM, but you're sending it to anywhere on the internet, right? And now I kind of feel like there was like a 12-month period post a ChatGPT moment where we were like, hey, we had the Samsung code leak thing where everybody was worried about your data being trained on the models. But now it's not about your data being trained by random models. It's about being sent to random parts of the internet. And now it's completely diffused from should we trust ChatGPT or should we trust OpenAI to can we trust, we'll have to essentially trust everybody on the internet if the agent has that permission, right? And I'm with you. I think it's like this weird cocktail of IAM plus data security problem, which is going to be pretty hard to solve. My sense is we'll have to solve that with identity because I don't think the data security problem is solvable. Or am I?
It's not deterministically solvable. You can never be 100%. Correct. Right? Like, and this is the challenge really with a lot of the prompt security stuff, right? Like, there's no way you're building an agent today where you're like not deploying something like a prompt foo or one of the AI like one of the prompt security vendors. Like it's just like bare metals. But the definition of the problem is you're applying a non-deterministic thing to non-deterministic problems. You're obviously going to have like an error rate, and it's like it just is, right? Over time, that stuff will get better and become quite adaptable, right? As they build up their training set, in the same way that like Cloudflare and Vercel became quite adaptable to React to Shell last week, right? Like yes, they found it, and yes, they did deploy some things that were not total fixes, but eventually, like within a week, we do have like the WAF is like relatively well protecting people from these attacks if they haven't updated their React versions. And I kind of think of like prompt security very much like that, which is there's going to be the window of time where there are very obvious attacks. I think one of the challenges though with that whole sector is we come back to one of the things you said, which is like task intent to prompt security intent, and how do you know how do you build up that data set and train? I think that's like one of the hardest challenges in this entire security space today. Like I don't have a strong answer. I wish I did. Like if I did, I'm sure I'd be very wealthy, but I don't. Yeah.
No, and I think I also feel like this most likely requires us humans to change the way we've been thinking about building and securing systems, because traditionally, we know the input and we know for sure what the output is going to be. But with this non-determinism baked in pretty much every agentic or non-agentic workflows, I think, and I think the React to Shell is a great example, right? Where Vercel, I think they started a hackathon program and they invited researchers to report WAF bypasses. And I think they've ended up paying close to $1 million or something. But that clearly shows that, look, whether it is deterministic or non-deterministic, we can build systems around it, like systems that are adaptable, systems that have least privilege, all of that stuff. So I think, yeah, it's going to be interesting. And I think it also explains why we are seeing a bunch of agents sort of built for internal use cases in
Yep.
enterprise and organizations, but we aren't seeing a lot of agents being exposed to external customers, right? And I think part of the big problem is that, like again, you mentioned with prompt injections sort of being one of the biggest attack vectors, you can't really control what the agent is doing with the data that is able to fetch on the internet, right? Um, which kind of brings me to the next question I had, along the same topic is, as we move towards sort of the agent economy or agent commerce, right, where
Yep.
you're going to have multiple agents, do financial transactions, interact with each other. How are you thinking about agent identity, where you literally have to expose an agent to the world?
Yeah, this is such a good question. I spent a lot of time thinking about this. This is something we think about a lot at KeyCard, right? Because we're not starting a company just to solve your internal IAM challenges or how you build an agent. We're thinking about like, how do we actually enable, like, how do we actually solve agent identity holistically so you can, we're that lever that helps you do the whole total transformation, right? And for most people, that's not just internal. It's also, hey, we're building agents, and hey, we're actually building products that agents want to interact with, right? And the whole gambit. And that's what it means for a company to become agent native, right? You run on agents, you are an agent, agents interact with you. And I think there's some emerging solutions, but like I think we should peel agents away and just think about like what's the structural problem on the internet today that we have that is all actually unsolved. I think like a lot of these agents don't introduce a ton of new problems. What they do is make a lot of problems we always had that we could kind of ignore must solve problems, right? And this is an example. This agent cross on the internet, public internet agent identity problem is one of those problems. Let's talk about Vercel for a hot second. Every Sunday, Vercel gets shut down in Spain because there's an app that runs on Vercel that takes in some, basically, I believe it's some football information that's like not supposed to be like on the internet. And well, for whatever reason, if you're an ISP, think about it. If you're an ISP and you're using and you're trying to shut off traffic to a domain on Vercel, and all you have is TCP/IP as your control filter, what do? Right?
Block it.
Yeah, it's all we have, right? So, and maybe we have some like deep packet inspection TLS stuff that can do some higher level things. But like in truth, we have a fundamental problem, which is we've always had a bot abuse and web identity problem at the app layer, which is that, our firewalls and the internet has been built on layer 1, 2, 3, and 4 broadly. With layer 4, like transport layer TLS, really being an application layer concern, not something that most networks or ISPs are dealing with, and not what most infrastructure deal with. And layer 5, there is no real control. The best we have is a WAF, and a WAF is like a blunt instrument, right? Because it also doesn't have the underlying like protocol or identity infrastructure to actually be able to be like, hey, who is this, right? Like that's why we have awful things like CAPTCHAs and like which bus is that? Is it a fucking light pole or what is it, right? Like that's why all this stuff exists, is because we don't have a way to identify and discern traffic on the internet. What we basically have is a user agent string, which is unauthenticated, and we have cookies, which in the authentication headers, right? And cookies come from the browser, the authentication headers come from something else, and it's not very good, especially if you're like a middleman, like an ISP, right? You can't figure it out. And so, one of the fundamental challenges we have and have had for a long time, especially if you're like a Vercel or if you're a Cloudflare or if you're any type of cloud hoster where you have a small set of IPv4 addresses or small set of IPv6 addresses, and you're not doing proper routing around that where you're giving everyone basically a static IP, you run into these challenges on the internet, which is just the way it is, right? You can't discern traffic between process A versus process B or app A versus app B running on the same computer. And now when we think about agents, well, the agent problem is very similar, which is like if my agent, Foo, is making a call to Google, how does Google know that's Foo, right? You don't want it to have to necessarily register with Google. You want some type of federated mechanism where that agent can actually identify itself in the same way. So what you can think about is a way of like having an authenticated user agent at the end of the day. And so there's a lot of ideas that are floating around. Cloudflare has WebBot Auth is an example for how to like identify application traffic. It's basically assigned HTTP, like you basically have message signatures in an HTTP thing. Then you have a way to look up the signing keys of that message and be like, hey, does this signing key locate back to an app I trust or not, right? And then there's a way for discovering what those keys in a federated manner, and very similar to OpenID Connect. And so that gives application layer a way to basically move with the world from unauthenticated traffic to authenticated traffic, and a path from us moving away from unauthenticated bots to authenticated bots. And that also gives a path to potentially in solving some of these challenges like we talked about for Cell as an example, right? So they can say, hey, it's for Cell, signs all the traffic comes out and says, hey, it's app A and this traffic's app B. So you should just kill app A's traffic, not app B's traffic, right? As we build up the application, as we build up the abstraction layers. And so we first have to solve a fundamental problem we never solved, which is identity on the internet, and how do we identify the apps that people are using, and then how do we identify the users that people are using, and then how do we can decide whether or not we want app A or app B to be able to use our website, right? And I don't think there's a difference between whether that's last generation bot that's scraping eBay for the latest latest bids, or it's someone's agent or Perplexity browser trying to do the same thing. And if you are if you're a commerce company, you're selling rideshare like Lyft, or you're Shopify.com, or if you're anybody, you want to protect your content website, we want to protect your content. We're going to move to a world where I think the web will require strong authentication, and it'll be up to the resource owner, the website, to decide, hey, who do we want to allow to use our website? And there's not very different than, requiring a user login in the first place. The question is, how do you do it in a way that doesn't require registration? And I think that's the primary thing that we have to solve, right? Like today, if to authenticate someone on the web, we basically have two mechanisms. You have all the crazy stuff that the ad networks do to try to reverse engineer who you are. And then you have registered users. And we are going to need to move to a world where if we want to make agents a first-class citizens, I know most businesses actually do want agents and apps to be a first-class citizen, they are going to require a control mechanism and require a mechanism for federated registration of those agents so that they can then decide, well, this agent behaves very well, so we let it in, and this is a bad behaving agent, so we don't let it in. And if you don't authenticate or if you don't identify yourself, then you don't get in at all. And I think what you'll see over the next 5 years is it's going to take some time, because the really big boys in the room, the Googles and the Amazon, the Facebooks that control most of the traffic on the internet, have to figure out what they want to do. But at the end of the day, I think it will happen, because it actually will drive higher transaction volume, and it will drive a new monetization mechanism on the internet, and it actually will make ads even better, because instead of us having this weird lossy digital fingerprint thing that it's kind of okay but not very okay, ads are going to be much better targeted, and there's much better attribution data as a result of that. And so I think that's where we're all going to end up.
I guess the best way to get the attention of the big tech companies is to make even better ads.
Exactly. If you can, it's all about bottom line. And they just got to figure out the best way and what order for it to happen. But I think the reason this will happen, by the way, and if we sit back and say, well, why won't they just leave it the way it is? It's fundamentally because I think the long tail of the internet is going to force it to happen, right? If you are not one of the big 7 or 10, where you have most of the internet's traffic, or you're one of the massive aggregators, where you are you're an agent like OpenAI, or potentially a Perplexity, or an Anthropic, or Google, or Microsoft, you have a problem. Your problem is you're being deeply disintermediated, right? You don't want traffic to be most agentic traffic just to exist in 5 companies in the world, because now they can rip and replace you in the same way that Google did to Yelp very easily, and call it just a natural feature of the technology. And that's the biggest thing that the long tail of the internet is most worried about. So their questions are, oh crap, how do we prevent disintermediation? How do we enable a long tail of the internet that allows us to continue to thrive, that allows lots of many agents to use us, and how to become embedded in the new application workflows and UI UX ecosystems. And so that's the thing that they're thinking about. And so that's why I'm saying over time, we will have new standards that emerge. The forces of economics will force it, and also the forces of antitrust will as well.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I was reading something about this new standard that is coming up. I think it's called AIUC. I don't know, Ian, if you've heard about it, but so that's like the. I think it was pretty interesting. It's basically like companies that want to build agents want to get the agents insured, right?
Yep.
So if you meet this standard, which is AIUC, then I think the chances of the agents being insured sort of increase higher. So yeah, it's. I think the next year or so, maybe the next couple of years, will be really fascinating to see, how we actually solve meaningful problems. Because I think I've heard quite a few chatter these days where folks have started to really question about what is it that they're working on, right? Because AI kind of makes most of the grunt work, mundane work go away, right? What that means is, I think what is how the world, at least in my mind, should be is humans can focus on things that really need their focus and attention, right? So yeah, I think so. Like you mentioned, right? Like it'll force us to answer questions about how identity works at the internet fundamentally.
Yep.
So yeah, very fascinating.
I think I was having this conversation with someone recently about SOC 2, right? Which is like, I think we can all admit is now almost the most useless certificate possible. It's made basically empty. But I think one of the things, like in the same way that we talked about like agents requiring strong authentication, right? Like we have to be able to identify not just the agent, we have to be able to identify the user, but why? Because ultimately it's about liability, right? It's about, well, if that agent goes and performs a transaction, we need to know whether that user actually told that agent to do the transaction or not, right? Because we have to basically figure out like who's responsible for it. Is it the agent builder? Is it the user? In the same way that like Tesla has to figure out when there's a car accident and self-driving is mode on, was it Tesla's fault? Was it a bug in the car? Or did the user do something really stupid, right? That they weren't allowed to do, right? And so I think just thinking about AIUC, I think about liability is going to be something we spend a lot of time talking about in a way that we never talked about before. And it's now because it's now becoming increasingly multi-party, right? Especially when you have sort of these multi-agent architectures that are coming to evolve, right? You can see a world where even in the consumer web, ChatGPT could talk to like a great shopping agent that then talks to Shopify, that then talks to like your credit card, that then talks to your bank, right? And they're all involved at some point. You need to draw all that line back to the agent, one way and the end user one way or the other, to say, hey, actually this user did say in fact that these agents could do this thing on their behalf. And then I think in terms of insurance, I think it makes total sense. And I think one of the core things that will be different is SOC 2 relies on auditors. I think the next generation of certificates are going to rely heavily on proven evidence, and you're going to have to prove to your insurer, you have to prove to your customers that what you say is true, and not on a 12-month basis, but on a continuous basis. Because otherwise, how do you price liability? You can't.
Yeah. I mean, I'm almost more bullish on. I'm going to get into trouble for saying this, but I'm almost more bullish on insurance solving this problem than InfoSec, because I kind of feel like the incentives are a lot more aligned if you're an insurance company because you've got to underwrite risk, whereas in InfoSec you don't really have to underwrite risk. Like you said, you can get away with SOC 2. SOC 2 in my head today is a sales enablement tool and less compliance tool actually, right? So yeah, if you can find a way to underwrite agentic risk and then like generate almost like thoughtful insurance policies out of it, maybe that's the right way to kind of encourage better behavior. But I kind of feel like that's another podcast episode on its own.
It's totally another podcast, but the one thing I'll add to it is one of the things to really think about, and I think about this a lot, is like in every generation of software, the job of security and the workflow changes, right? I think about on-prem. I think we've all been around long enough to remember the world of on-prem when the firewall rules were controlled by network security. And then we moved to the cloud, and guess who owns it? Not security anymore. Maybe in some organizations, but very few. And it's in the R&D org, it's in engineering someplace where they own the IAC rules, right? And then your security got stuck into remediatory patterns, right? But over time, something started to emerge, which was sort of the concept of security engineering, which is, hey, we're going to just offer the developers really great components that result in us having secure software. And I think agents are going to drive runtime like guarantees up the wazoo, in the sense that we're going to have significantly less remediatory workflows because you won't be able to deal with the scale and ephemerality and let's say the speed of execution and the speed of mistakes that these things can make. And so as a result, you're going to have to build the guarantees in from the ground up. And so I think like the industry that's going to change the most, as it always does, big change between on-prem and cloud, and there'll be another big change between cloud and what do we call this agent thing I've been calling the agent native. Like agent native revolution or whatever you want to think about it, is also result in a massive change in security, in the same way that it's also result in a massive change in the way that we build organizations. And a lot of things will end up getting collapsed together that potentially used to be like considered separate, just as a way that this sort of change in workflow and capability changes the way that we work together.
Yeah. And speaking about different domains collapsing into each other, I've been having this conversation quite a bit recently about the future of AppSec, right? Like, why is there a need for AppSec engineers in the first place when you can actually have developers create secure code? So, yeah, I think I think we can all see the sort of the horizon where we know what it should look like. Now, again, like how fast, how slow, I think we can all speculate, but yeah, it's going to be very interesting. Okay, I guess, Ian, we have time for one more question before we let you go. So, you recently acquired, I think it's called Rulebook.
Yeah.
I hope I said that right. To basically focus on MCP or model context protocol, right? But looking at MCP security itself, it seems pretty terrifying that something like a prompt injection can lead to tool execution directly. How does Keycard technically prevent a confused deputy attack when an agent is tricked into calling a destructive tool? Are you intercepting the JSON payload mid-flight, or are you doing something else? Anything that you can share?
This is a really, really good question. And so we haven't shared all of our secrets, but I'll tell you my broad thoughts on this problem. And I kind of already shared with you my broad thoughts on this problem early in the podcast. I look at this as like, okay, well, what is a poison tool in the first place, right? And a poison tool in the first place is a tool that is unauthenticated, right? MCP is really interesting because in MCP, you basically have two types of like servers. You have remote servers and you have local servers. And the biggest problem related to MCP actually comes to the fact that you have these local servers are distributed through package managers, and that we don't have really good control over it. It's a really terrible shadow IT problem. But if you think about remote MCP servers, we actually have pretty good controls in place for that. First and foremost, we have TLS. So if the MCP server is like mcp.github.com, well, we have all of the wonderful things that the internet gives us to know that MCP server is in fact the MCP server by GitHub. And so at that point, we're basically sitting there saying like, do we trust GitHub to have a tool that is trusted or not, right? So I think we have to first sit back and say, we do actually have a lot of some of these problems solved one way or the other. There is the underlying problem ultimately that like, let's say in GitHub MCP, it could read an issue that has, a prompt comes from an unauthenticated user that could, potentially poison the context window and then result in, unaligned behavior in the agent, right? Unaligned from the intent of the user or the agent builder. That is still a fundamental issue. And that is not something that Keycard solves for the reason that it is a very interesting prompt security problem, but that's not something that we're up to solving right this second. But what we do solve for you is help you identify and authenticate and validate the tools, identify and authenticate and validate the agent, then apply access control. So as an example, let's make sure our agent doesn't use a repository we don't trust or doesn't talk to, pull PII from a Snowflake instance that we don't want it to pull PII from, or uses a tool after another tool that it's not allowed to use. Those are the class of problems that we're really focused on. And I think those practical problems, when they add all up together, start to give you the controls you really need to actually solve the more holistic problem as well. And that's sort of a foundational pillar to addressing any of these challenges today.
Got it. So I think at some point we have to put a trust in these companies that are building these remote MCP servers, right? Because unless we do that, it's basically who are you trusting and with what access permissions, right? Yeah.
Exactly. And I don't think that changes. I think at the end of the day, it's like the conversation with insurance, right? At the end of the day, the thing that actually matters is the legal agreement between the companies, right? Because if you're if you're downloading random software off the internet, that has always been a hazardous affair, right? It's buyer beware, user beware, even shareware in the 1998, right? On Napster. Like that was always like, all right, you can do it, but I mean, I hope you're not running on Windows, right? So, whereas, with a B2B setting, we're building software for other people, or we're building software for ourselves, and we're using software from other people ourselves. We are always going to have a contract in place. And ultimately, from that position, we can at least say, the builders of the software, they have intent and they have liability, and thus we have recourse, and then we can adjust our incentives. That isn't to say that we also don't need, good things like prompt security, that is also applied at runtime to be able to deal with the adaptive. I think at the core of it, it's not just prompt security. It's also about having adaptive tight access controls that are granular, that put all of the different parties in control, and also, by doing that, drastically reduce the blast radius, and then also at the same time move us from a world of like long-lived secrets and API keys that are all over the place that then get sucked up into agents and sent into browser windows and all this other silly stuff. So that's how we're trying to reduce this sort of agentic risk, and at the same time help companies modernize and really take advantage of this pretty transformative technology.
As I think about, how we move from on-prem to cloud, where folks were initially hesitant in trusting platforms like AWS, but now everybody is on AWS. So if something goes wrong with AWS, there are companies that are not able to serve their customers. So I think the same paradigm sort of applies here as well, right? Where at some point we have to trust like somebody. And then I think as that trust gets breached or whatever, we learn from that, and then we implement certain controls, and then we move on. I think that seems to be the theme, right?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, right? I mean, I think the only difference between the server era and the cloud era and the AI era is that it almost felt like every time these technologies came, the tech folks, like the three of us and everybody else, had to go and convince business to transform.
Yep.
But this time it's kind of the other way around. It's almost it's extremely top down. It's like the CEOs are giving mandate to CTOs to kind of implement AI, which kind of makes me feel like this is happening without tech risk being factored in. Now, it's not that if you factor tech risk in, you'll magically manage them well. So we've seen all the incidents with cloud security and stuff. But this to me is very different, because I remember being in rooms when cloud became a thing, say where the CTOs were pushing the CEOs to think about cloud, and the vendors had to do a lot of pushing.
Yep.
Nobody's doing the pushing right now. It's all coming from the top, which is very different, but also kind of scary. But it also means that there's nobody fighting for AI security budget. Like, I mean, again, I'm putting on my vendor hat. Everybody has an AI security budget, which was different from a cloud security budget, because that took many, many years to come. Maybe that's the silver lining.
No, I think that is absolutely correct, right? Like, cloud was driven by the engineering organization or the development or the IT organization wanting to have be able to retain their developers, right? And also like reduce time to like product and
Deploy,
increase like project success rate. Like that's what, it wasn't a business, like the business cared in the sense of like, yeah, okay, if you can promise us like better transition, I guess we'll fund this thing you want. But like the board in most corporations are like, well, what are we going to get the next pair of shoes, right? Now, every organization, whether you're selling fizzy beverages to like selling shoes to, you're selling data lakes, like everybody's focused on, this is a net productivity improver. This is how we get earnings growth, whether that's by saving money because we have less headcount spend or less other spend, or it's because we're going to make more money because we're like way more productive one way or the other, or because our products are way more competitive, or we're going to sell more things. The agent is going to result in more transaction volume. Is like the business realizes that this is a huge uplift in terms of what they can do. And it's an imperative as a result, because everyone's realizing the same thing at the same time. It's imperative that they go through it. And so I truly believe we're at the very beginnings. Like this is like 1996. We may have like a couple 2001s, right? Between now and 2010 and then, like 2010 or 2012 and our eventual 2020. But we're very early. But I don't think the business is going to change their perspective on this over the long period of time, and that transformation ultimately will drive us to a more productive society. It's just going to be a bit messy on the way.
Yeah. I do think though that the 1960 to 2010 reference is bang on, but what
Yep.
took 15 years will probably take 5 years here, just
Agreed.
given the speed of everything else. So it's going to be a bumpy but fun few years.
Exactly. Super exciting.
Yeah. All right. On that note.
Yeah. Awesome, Ian. This was a very interesting conversation. We appreciate you taking the time out, and we hope to see you again soon.
I was loved
Thank you so
having
much.
it. It was such a fun time. It's been never more interesting to be in security than this moment.
That's right.
I agree.
Thank you
Ian.
so much, Ian.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.